It's Tuesday, the 8th of November. This is Politics Live. Joining me today, Conservative peer Ed Vaizey, the SNP's Kirsty Blackman, the political editor of Tortoise, Neilan, and GB News presenter Tom Harwood. Today,
we are on a highway to climate hell with our foot still on the accelerator.
That was the UN Secretary-General's stark message to world leaders at the climate summit in Egypt.
This is about the future and the planet that we leave our children, but it's also about the here and now.
But is that compatible with the government's drive to get more oil and gas? This cabinet minister is facing fresh allegations of bullying. Is Rishi Sunak right to stand by him? These ancient Greek sculptures have been in Britain for 200 years. But Ed Vaizey, heading up a new committee on the masterpieces, says a deal to return them to Greece is now within reach. Let's start with the front page of the Eye. Red alert for Earth, gravest warning yet on climate change. Echoing the words of Antonio Guterres, you heard him there in the headline, Secretary-General of the United Nations, speaking at the climate conference, COP27, yesterday. Let's listen to a bit more.
It has a choice, cooperate or perish. It is either a climate solidarity pact or a collective suicide pact. We are on a highway to climate hell with our foot still on the accelerator.
Antonio Guterres, there my question to the panel to start the programme. Stark language, is it proportionate and right to use that sort of language, Ed?
Oh, well, I think it is. I think I have no problem talking about a climate emergency and saying that we have to do very serious things.
A suicide pact, that we're on the road to climate hell.
Well, using that phrase, he got on your programme and he's probably sold a few AC/DC records as well along the way. But, I mean, I don't think there's anything wrong with the Secretary-General of the UN speaking in stark terms to get people's attention. I mean, but obviously we've been here before. We have a COP every year. We have warm words every year. We need to see real and sincere action. And obviously the biggest challenge for climate change is individual countries can take action, but can you take collective action that significantly moves the dial? And obviously, in terms of the row that's been going on at COP, in terms of reparations, the developing world saying perfectly legitimately, you lot grew rich on the back of climate change, and now you want to make us poorer.
So you would support the idea of reparations, would you?
No, I wouldn't support the idea of reparations, but I can understand what... I'm just illustrating how difficult it is to get collective action where everyone is prepared, as it were, to take the measures that are necessary to really make an impact on global warming. Well,
let's go back to the language that's used because, interestingly, Kirsty, Ed said there, here we are again, another climate change conference, warm words. Does the language work, that sort of language, in terms of bringing people on board to take on this emergency?
I mean, I think we should be using this language every week, not just in the week of COP27 or COP26. This is the biggest challenge for our generation. I think it's completely reasonable to be using this language, to be clear that this is the tipping point, or we're beyond the tipping point almost. We need to be taking this much more seriously than we have been up until now.
Kat?
I actually slightly disagree. I think probably the question is, who is he speaking to? Is he speaking to heads of state governments, or is he talking to people at home? Because I just think a lot of my friends and family feel quite scared. And when they hear that kind of language, they think, what can I do about it? And then that either results in people feeling very emotional, and you see people sort of climbing up on the gantries on the M25 crying, or people just switching off and thinking, I can't do anything about it, and burying their heads in the sand. And neither of those are really the solutions that you want.
Language, is it proportionate?
It's totally not proportionate.
Why
it's
not?
living on another planet. We're in a situation today where 90% of the world's economy has signed up to net zero. We're living in a situation today where the UK has reduced its carbon emissions by 50% since 1990. I mean, to say that nothing is being done is frankly preposterous, and it ignores the progress that can be made. It ignores the real importance of looking at where progress has been made so that that can be built upon. To deny anything's been done, to say that things are getting worse.
Well, you may not be denying anything everything's being done, but to say that we may still be on the road to climate hell.
Climate hell is the most peculiar phrase, and it leads to real-world problems. Before the last German elections in 2021, there were a group of school children who called themselves the last generation. They went on hunger strike, and many of them ended up in hospital. When they were interviewed, they said, in 20 years, Europe is going to be starving. There's going to be famine on our continent. People will die. This is the real peculiar cult that has built up of these anti-scientific predictions, which no legitimate organisation in the world genuinely believes.
Oh, well, Ed?
Well, I can't speak for the actions of German school children, and people behave in peculiar ways on the basis of a whole lot of issues. I'm just saying that I don't think there's anything wrong with the UN Secretary-General using stark words. I mean, I completely agree with Tom that, you know, certainly the UK government has a fine record, both governments, Labour and Conservative governments, over the last 20 or 30 years in terms of reducing emissions. I think what is missing, if you like, is this idea that there is a win-win in terms of climate change, in terms of energy security, which we're all very conscious of because of Ukraine, and in terms of our economy, in terms of creating the industries that a future economy will depend upon. And what I don't get from this government, perhaps, is a sense of a kind of national mission where we can really move the dial. And I totally agree with Kat that, you know, individuals find it, they can't kind of see the wood for the trees in terms of their own individual actions. And what you want are big gestures from government. I mean, interestingly, this will sound completely nerdy, but there was this agreement on sea lanes between Europe and America going carbon neutral. That's the kind of thing that does move the dial.
Well, we'll talk about that in a minute. You were shaking your head while Tom was talking.
Yeah, I mean, nobody's living on a different planet. The point is, this is the planet we have, and this is the only one we have, and we absolutely need to take action. Scotland was the first part of the UK to declare a climate emergency. Scotland has got more ambitious climate change targets. And in terms of what Kat was saying, we need to have that public pressure. We need to have people aware of what the scenario is so that our politicians will take it more seriously, so that actual action will happen. And we won't have people like David Cameron saying, cut the green crap. We won't have those. We will have a concerted view from politicians of all parties in actually moving forward and tackling this, but we'll only get that if we get that public pressure.
Let me introduce Carla Denyer, co-leader of the Green Party, because we're going to discuss the energy crisis and the response to it from an environmental perspective. Welcome to you, Carla. We're just going to show everybody the headline in the Daily Telegraph: gas deal set to ease energy crisis. This is the story that the US is planning to sell 10 billion cubic metres of liquefied natural gas to the UK over the coming year. First of all, are we right, Carla, to be striking deals to bring in more gas?
Well, unfortunately, I think this is yet another example of where years of Tory government failure in terms of policies to push the rapid transition to renewable energy and insulating homes has led us. That's a conscious policy decision. We can either keep people's homes warm in the winter by burning millions of tonnes of gas, or by insulating homes so that they hardly require heating. And the Tories have chosen the former.
Right. Ed, what do you say? It's a failure of policy that actually we may be forced into, we are going to go ahead and do this deal with the US.
Well, again, without wishing to sound like a stuck record, I think both Labour and Conservative governments have this country has a great record in terms of our transition to renewables. We've effectively eliminated coal. We've reduced our emissions by 40 or 50%, while our economy has grown by 75% over the last 30 years. So we are, I think, one of the poster countries for how you transition to renewables. I would like to see more action in terms of nuclear power. I would like to see more action in terms of offshore wind farms and solar farms. And yes, 15 years ago, when I sat on a committee and we recommended that all new homes be built with renewable energy, the coalition government decided not to pursue that because their focus was on building homes and not adding to the cost. So that was probably a missed opportunity.
Right, but you're in favour of these sorts of deals to bring in more gas into this country?
Yes, I am, but I also am in favour of a medium plan that gets us to energy self-sufficiency based on renewable energy sources.
Well, Carla, what do you say in response to Ed's defence of the government?
Well,
she's speechless.
If we're really in this situation where the government has no choice at this late stage but to purchase gas to get us through this winter without blackouts, they've got access to the data on that, I don't. That may be an unavoidable consequence, but let's be clear, it's a consequence of 12 years of disastrous Tory policy. We needn't have been in this situation now, but we are because of decisions they've made over the last 12 years.
I mean, I think you can always pick
up on something that Tom said earlier, and I think it's worth addressing because he was really setting up a straw man there, saying that it was untrue that nothing is happening. Nobody is claiming that the UK is doing nothing on climate change, but what is undoubtedly true, what the government's own climate change committee has said, what the UN Secretary General has said, is that not enough is happening. And so I would really appreciate if we could stop with this ridiculous self-congratulatory nonsense where we just have this one-upmanship about who's doing the most when nobody is doing enough. What we need to see from Rishi Sunak at COP27 is leadership and collaboration. We need to make sure that, yes, as one of the richest countries in the world that has contributed the most to historical carbon emissions, let's not forget, it's not just about what we're emitting now, it's our responsibility to lead from the front and to help those countries. We were talking about reparations earlier. Reparations is a bit of a fancy word, but however you do it, help those countries who've done the least to contribute to this crisis and yet are living at the sharp end.
All right, let Tom respond.
I'm not sure which maths you're using, but over the last 8 years, China has produced more CO2 than the United Kingdom has done in the history of the United Kingdom. So clearly, yes, whilst a higher proportion during the Industrial Revolution of CO2 emissions come from this country, as a proportion of total emissions, it doesn't touch the sides. But clearly, you haven't been listening to what these people who've been smashing windows or throwing paint over buildings or lying down in the middle of the roads have been saying. These are radicalised individuals who genuinely believe that the government is doing nothing, that there is no progress, and that the country and indeed the world is on this path to hell in short order. That is a dangerous, radicalised idea, and it needs to be challenged.
I mean, China does have an enormous population by comparison to the UK, of course, Tom. The Committee on Climate Change does say that the UK needs to do more. But Kat, are new gas deals, like the one that might be signed with the US, compatible with Rishi Sunak's pledge to deliver on climate commitments?
Well, I'm going to slightly agree with Ed that it is a sort of stopgap necessary measure. But I think fundamentally we do need to see a sort of change in attitude. And at risk of saying that Liz Truss was right about something, I think the sort of liberalising rules around onshore wind would be massively helpful. And I'm quite concerned that Rishi Sunak seems to be turning back on that.
Well, that's one thing, deals to be done to bring in gas. Let's have a look at this story in the Financial Times. UK starts new round of licences for North Sea oil and gas. This is the story that the North Sea Transition Authority is returning to the process of awarding more than 100 licences for new gas and oil exploration in the North Sea. Something you'd welcome, Kirsty?
What we want to see is robust climate compatibility assessments for any new licences that are granted. And actually, if you look at the Climate Change Committee comments on this, if you look at the International Energy Agency comments on this, they are asking for that same thing. They are asking for climate compatibility checks to be done in order to see, will this actually materially have a negative impact on the amount of emissions that we're creating? Will it push us over 1.5%?
But why can't there be a clear answer? This idea of a compatibility test. How can oil and gas exploration ever be compatible in terms of protecting the climate?
Well, we're asking for that check to be done. We're asking for... I mean, we've just heard, you know, this is an apocalyptic scenario. This is
why don't you just
a
rule
tipping
it out?
point.
Why don't you, Scotland, with your Green partners, just rule out any further exploration
because it has
of oil and gas licences?
It has to be done in a science-based way, in which case, looking at the assessments of that, looking at the way that this is going to go forward...
This is why we're in a climate... This is why we're in an energy crisis. The SNP can't allow any new exploration without all of these processes. Indeed, the SNP
we're
blocks
not in
new
control
nuclear
of the
power
policy.
stations.
Let her
stations. Can I just finish this point?
Yeah, but finish the sentence and then come back to Kirsty.
Nuclear power stations in Scotland blocked by the SNP. The Tories block onshore wind. Labour Party, they block shale gas exploration. The Lib Dems block just about anything being built anywhere. And the Greens, even the Greens, have blocked a solar farm in Rutland.
Well, we'll come back to
every single party blocking all of the infrastructure that this country desperately needs.
Energy policy is reserved. It is up to the UK government to make the decisions on this. The UK government are making the decision. So whatever the SNP has said on that, we're not in control of this.
It's a bit of a cop-out, though, because you can still make a principled sort of stand on this
Absolutely,
issue,
which is what we're trying to do. We're saying that we want investment in a just transition. We're investing £500 million in just transition. We've asked the UK government to match this, and they've thus far refused.
Hang on, banning new nuclear in Scotland.
I'm going to come back to the issue of nuclear energy if we have time. But first of all, Carla, to respond, when you listen to Kirsty Blackman talking about this climate compatibility test, is that enough for you? Does that sound fairly sensible when it comes to a transitioning to a greener economy and still having those licences granted for oil and gas exploration?
So it's positive to see the SNP are starting to move in the right direction on this. Since the Greens, the Scottish Greens, our sister party, went into government with the SNP just over a year ago, we've seen the Scottish National Party's position on climate and specifically on North Sea oil and gas move considerably towards more rapid climate action and not necessarily pursuing as much oil and gas. That's not where the Green Party of England and Wales or the Scottish Green Party are. We're very clear that we need to see no more new licences for oil and gas in the North Sea. The reason for that is not just the amount of the amount of gas that we are using now. That needs to be wound down as quickly as possible while recognising it can't happen by tomorrow morning. But the problem with granting new oil and gas licences in the North Sea now is that that would lock us in to much more than the 1-year reliance on gas that US contract implies. It would mean investment in infrastructure which will rapidly become stranded assets. That'll cost the UK government money. It's a waste of money, and it risks locking us into dependence on fossil fuels for longer than we should be.
So are you saying, Carla, it's impossible to pass a climate compatibility test in terms of oil and gas exploration?
I would love to see the Scottish National Party's calculations on what kind of oil and gas installation in the North Sea would pass such a test. I can't see what that would be.
Kirsty?
I mean, the reality is that these tests are not being done. And actually, to sort of counter what you were saying about the SNP's position in the coalition or the agreement that we have in partnership with the Greens, is that we have been making this case in advance of any agreement that we have with the Greens. And I welcome the fact that we are in government together in Scotland. I think that's great. I think we're pulling in the same direction. We're all moving towards an independent country where we can make our own decisions here. But we have been here. We are making the case in a much stronger way than the Labour Party are, in a much stronger way than the Conservatives are, in order that we need to make our climate change meet our climate change obligations. And that was in advance of the coalition agreement partnership agreement that we've got in place with the Greens.
Should we drill for more oil and gas, even if it's short-term, medium-term, Kat?
I think it's probably, by the time you allow for the sort of stuff to come on site, it feels like it's a sort of lot of investment and not much gain. It's 5 years, I think, until you actually...
Well, they're saying that they could actually move more quickly in order to extract it, maybe 12 to 18 months.
Well, then again, as a stopgap, perhaps, but my preference would be more renewables, nuclear plants which under Boris Johnson, he was talking about possibly even building one a year, which obviously seems unlikely. But, you know, the ambition to build more nuclear plants to get more energy from that would be preferable.
I mean, doesn't it weaken UK diplomacy to encourage other, probably developing countries to adopt ambitious climate policies if we're going to continue to drill for fossil fuels?
We do currently have ambitious climate policies.
Yeah, but if you're wanting to encourage other countries not to go down that path in the future, developing countries, when we have done it for a century and a half, isn't it a little bit hypocritical to then...
It depends on outcomes, not processes. And clearly the outcome of the last 30 years has been halving our CO2 emissions. That's a clear outcome that other countries, frankly, should follow. But ultimately, what we've been discussing for the last 10 minutes is what we should do and what we shouldn't do, which should be invested in, which shouldn't. Frankly, we're in an energy crisis. People are struggling to heat their homes. The idea that we would stop any source of energy being developed in this country at this stage is bonkers, and it is making us poorer.
Right. I mean, the point is, if there's ever going to be put to exploring for fossil fuels, when is it going to be? This will mean we'll still be exploiting oil and gas for decades probably to come.
Well, I mean, look, Kirsty's in a difficult position because potentially these sites are very good for the Scottish economy, and I will certainly be using the climate compatibility test to sit on the fence in any other argument you try and draw me into. But having said that, I do think there is common ground developing here. I mean, you've got Tom here, who is talking about an energy crisis. He wouldn't talk about a climate emergency. That would be an anathema phrase for Tom to use, but he can talk about an energy crisis. We know that in the UK, going forward, in every country, we should try and be as energy self-sufficient as possible, and that where possible, we should be investing in renewable energy sources as quickly as possible. Now, if I don't know enough about these oil and gas fields and whether they're essential and whether there'll be an essential stopgap, but if they do provide us with energy security as we transition, I would be in favour of them.
Well, I mean, if we need gas, then, I mean, Carlo, then we might as well have our own gas. We might as well drill for our own gas or make deals to bring that gas in. Surely that would be better for energy security going forward.
I don't think so, for exactly the reason I just said, that exploring for new oil and gas now, setting up new oil and gas infrastructure in the UK now, will lock us into dependence on fossil fuels for the medium to long term. That's exactly the opposite from the direction we need to be going.
Right, but do you accept what Tom has pointed out, that actually UK has cut its emissions in half? Do you accept that that has happened and that that is progress?
The UK has cut its emissions, but not as fast as it needs to be doing. I'm just basing this on the science here, the science from the UN's very best climate scientists.
Which G20 country has cut emissions faster than the United Kingdom in the last 30 years? Any of them? Name one.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the question.
Which G20 country has cut emissions by a greater percentage than the United Kingdom has since 1990?
I'm sorry, I don't have the
Not
answer
a single
to
one
that.
has. The United Kingdom has cut emissions by more than any G20 country.
Great.
That is a remarkable success story. And to denigrate that, to try and pretend that hasn't happened, to say that that isn't enough, that that's not a path that we are going on that is positive,
we all know
is
that you work for
peculiar,
GB
deeply
News,
peculiar.
which is, Tom, we all know that you work for GB News, which is a far-right propagandist organisation.
Well, hang on. Slander. That's
who are
just
climate
slander.
deniers.
Well, hang on,
I think it's
Carlo.
Hang
on.
So I think we need to take what you're saying with a pinch
No,
of
we're not
salt.
going to have a whole new discussion. But Carla, since you've made that accusation, so you played the man in this case rather than the ball, you have to let Tom respond.
I just think it's useful to have a context of where these messages are coming from.
I just think people will find it very peculiar that.
Well, hang on. Let her finish.
There.
Well, let her finish her.
Climate denial. Climate denial is pretty socially unacceptable these days in the UK. So the organisations and the people that were previously behind climate denial are now moving on to a climate delaying approach. And I think that's what we're seeing here today from Tom, unfortunately.
I'm not sure what's climate delaying about championing the reduction in CO2 emissions that this country has achieved. I'm not sure what's climate delaying about championing the need for onshore wind farms, about combating the Green Party where it's blocked onshore solar farms. I mean, this is such a ridiculous ad hominem attack because, frankly, your arguments are not standing up. If you look at what I have been saying on these issues, and indeed many of my colleagues, it is incredibly progressive. It's caring about the poorest in society. It's making sure that we do deliver the cleanest, greenest possible economy without without bankrupting us in the process.
Well,
let me let
Carla respond because the line is looking a little shaky. Carla, you respond.
Yeah, well, my point is about the straw man that Tom has been setting up, saying that we're saying no progress has been made. Nobody is saying that no progress has been made. However, the science is clear that progress in the UK and globally on tackling climate change is not moving fast enough. And, you know, it would be very convenient to ignore the science and to say, oh, well, we're still doing a good job, even if we're not quite meeting our targets. As one of the other guests said earlier, we only have one planet. We have to make sure that we reduce our carbon emissions as fast as possible and in a socially equitable way.
All right.
We were talking earlier about the importance of making sure that people's lights stay on, that they have a warm, comfortable home. Of course, I absolutely agree. That's a top priority. But the most effective way of doing that is by insulating people's homes, a mass rollout of insulation across the UK, and bringing in renewables, which is around 9 times cheaper than fossil fuels at the moment. So it is, and they can be rolled out faster. There are hundreds of wind and solar farms in the UK that have got planning permission but haven't yet been installed. That can be done much more quickly than installing new gas projects.
If only Green Party councillors would stop opposing renewable energy
The only way through
in their own
the only way through this is to give Carla a show on GB News.
And on that, Carla Denyer, thank you for that, Ed Vaizey. Carla Denyer, before the line breaks up, apologies for slight interference there, but we got all of that. Thank you for joining us. We're going to move on. We're going to talk about Cabinet Minister Gavin Williamson. We discussed the WhatsApp messages he sent to the former Chief Whip, Wendy Morton. There are, I think, 2 processes underway investigating those. He has said, Gavin Williamson, that he regrets those messages, but today there is more. This is the story in The Guardian. Senior civil servant claims Gavin Williamson told them to slit your throat. MOD official says Minister subjected them to campaign of bullying when he was Defence Secretary. Gavin Williamson strongly rejects the allegation of bullying. Let's talk to Nick Eardley, BBC Chief Political Correspondent. Another day and another serious allegation against the behaviour of Gavin Williamson. I'm sure Cabinet this morning, you'd have liked to have been a fly on the wall. Where is this heading, Nick?
Well, look, Joe, I think there's a couple of things that will worry Number 10. One is that different allegations keep coming out. So there's the new one in The Guardian this morning, which Mr Williamson denies the broad point that he's been accused of bullying. He doesn't deny the language that was used that you just mentioned. So it will worry Number 10 that there are a lot of different strands to this. The second thing that I think will worry them is that when it comes to Wendy Morton, that kind of blue-on-blue battle about what happened in those WhatsApps, she is clearly incredibly unhappy with what is going on, because not only is she complained to the party, and the party is now looking into this, although, to be honest, having tried to find out what is going on with that process, it seems to be incredibly slow and incredibly secretive. She's also now complained to the independent complaints and grievances scheme in Parliament. So it's no longer in the control of the Conservative Party. There's now a separate strand to that investigation. So I think it feels to me like, rather than this story maybe fizzling out, which is what I thought Number 10 would hope, it seems like it's growing arms and legs, and there are some in government I know who are quite nervous that there could be more to come yet.
And we're going to discuss Gavin Williamson further with the panel in just a moment. But let's return to Suella Braverman, the Home Secretary, because today the opposition, Labour Party, is going to have an Opposition Day debate, as we call it in the jargon, about her and her future. What's happening?
They are trying to force the government to release any information. Rishi Sunak was given any warnings he was given before he reappointed Suella Braverman as Home Secretary. Got to say, I think it's unlikely that's going to pass. But it just shows that pressure on another of Rishi Sunak's big appointments to the Cabinet is kind of fizzling under as well. This Gavin Williamson story has become the big one this week, and I think there's probably more to come on it. But when it comes to Suella Braverman, there are a lot of people who still think that she's not been totally open about what went on, and the Labour Party in particular are trying to find out a bit more about what the Prime Minister knew. They're saying this all comes back to Rishi Sunak's judgment and whether he made the right decisions to try and unite his party and who he put in Cabinet.
Nick Eardley, thank you very much. Kat, you actually broke the initial story about Gavin Williamson and those WhatsApp messages. We can show our viewers. Tortoise here. Rishi Sunak's judgment questioned after Minister Gavin Williamson accused of sending threatening messages. Can he survive?
Well, I mean, as Nick was saying there, I think Number 10 was kind of rather hoping that it would just be a short story and then it would be quickly forgotten. It was picked up by the Sundays and taken forward with the screenshots of the messages. And then, of course, we heard this really appalling story from The Guardian yesterday where he's threatening to, or saying something about slitting someone's throat. I mean, it's just, the language is just appalling. And, you know, last night, Nicky Morgan, former minister herself, saying that she wasn't surprised she'd had her own run-ins with Gavin Williamson. I think, having spoken to several Conservative MPs about this, there isn't surprise about this kind of story coming out. It is a long time coming, and there aren't that many MPs who have good things to say about him.
Is it acceptable, Ed Vaizey, that a Cabinet Minister behaves in this way and uses that sort of language and approach with colleagues?
Well, I mean, obviously the answer you want me to say is it's not acceptable, but I mean the fact is it goes on between colleagues, and I think that, you know, MPs to a certain extent are autonomous people, and sometimes leading a political party, you imagine you're trying to corral 350 chief executives who represent their constituency and have their own views, and sometimes colleagues have robust exchanges with each other. I have had
slit your throat comment was
I
not
have had
MP to MP. It was
a
MP
robust
to
exchange.
official.
When I was a minister, I had a robust exchange with a minister because I came on this programme and was rude about him. And I got a very robust exchange, which I framed. I keep it on my windowsill.
So you wore that as a badge of honour, but in this
and
instance,
sometimes
when it
you
comes...
just have to roll with it. And I have to say, I mean, I'm not going to necessarily defend Gavin Williams's text, but I have to say, if you're the chief whip engaging with your colleagues, sometimes you're going to get pretty robust replies sometimes if you're asking them to do things either they don't want to. I mean, I think arguing about whether or not you're invited to the Queen's funeral is pretty in for a dig, but I think, you know, if you're the chief whip, you're going to expect to have some pretty fiery rows with people.
Right, so you don't think he should go? You think he should stay?
Well, I think that I wouldn't want to wake up and be Gavin Williamson this morning. It's no fun to be in the eye of a media storm. It is quite clear that more stories may well emerge because effectively the green light has been given. And I think Kat is right. You know, everybody knew about the image that Gavin Williamson portrayed. I mean, I've never met this famous tarantula, but that was the whole thing, was a kind of, you know, Francis Urquhart straight out of House of Cards. I mean, it was slightly sort of pantomime and I think mildly sort of pathetic, but that was the image he portrayed. And clearly a lot of bad will has been stored up. And Kat's story, frankly, has given people, I think, permission, if you like, to start coming up with their own Gavin Williams story. And the terrible old political cliche, you know, the longer this goes on, the harder it is for Gavin Williamson.
Kirsty?
I mean, I would agree the issue here is Rishi Sunak's judgment. The fact that he put Suella Braverman in knowing that she publicly stepped away because of a security issue. She publicly resigned because of that. And yet he chose to put her in cabinet because of some sort of, I don't know, deal that was struck in advance of him becoming the leader, in advance of her resigning and, you know, ensuring that he could become the leader. And then to put Gavin Williamson in knowing that there was a complaint and knowing that there had been this issue with Wendy Morton. And do you know what? I've never had an exchange with colleagues where there has been swearing.
I don't think the SNP,
and I was the deputy...
I mean, I haven't done my press cuttings. Tom, who is the font of all wisdom on all these things, I'm sure there have been SNP moments where people have taken chunks out of each other in the SNP. I mean, if you're going to now pretend that the SNP is a sort of kumbaya party where nobody argues with each other,
what I'm saying is,
pull the other one.
I was the deputy leader of the party in Westminster for 3 years. I never had that sort of discussion that Gavin Williams has had, no matter whether you're saying that there's robust discussions take place. That absolutely did not happen between me and my colleagues.
Hang on, I mean, there is a level, though, isn't there? There is robust. There's a robust. Fine. Well, I'll come back to that in a moment. But in general, this accusation of there being, as Labour say, a toxic culture now within Westminster, is it also a point of 12 years of Conservatives being in government that the behaviour level, the level of discourse is beginning to deteriorate?
I think we're all forgetting what a whipping system is and what a Westminster system is. There were these stories under New Labour, there were these stories under John Major, there were these stories under Margaret Thatcher, there were certainly these stories under Jim Callaghan.
James Graham, the playwright, made a whole career out of it.
Yeah, but this was also, when you mention then John Major, that was at the end of another very long stint of the Conservatives being in power, and the same with Blair and Brown.
Absolutely. At the end of his tenure.
So is that what it is?
But I don't think it is that. Coming out just shows the kind of level of bad blood that there is at the minute between.
Well, there is definitely
party.
I mean, I think I won't name names, but there are certain people who've left the government who now are being very free with what went on behind the scenes.
There are loads of people that have left government that are sitting on the back bench.
But I think Tom makes a very good point. I mean, James Graham's play said in the last...
This House
said in the last year of the Callaghan government, the famous grabbing of body parts by chief whips and so on.
Yeah.
And of course, I've forgotten the whole Alex Salmond...
That was the 1970s.
Nicholas Sturgeon.
Hang on,
which played out in the
contemporaneously,
Wait a
we
bit,
can look to successors of Gavin Williamson, one of whom kept a castration device for bulls on his
desk. Hang on,
this is the kind of intimidation
But does it make it acceptable? No. I mean, the point is, this stuff is now coming out. How does it sit? I mean, you're laughing at, but how does it sit with Rishi Sunak's commitment to integrity, professionalism and accountability?
I realise I've dug myself in a hole here. I'll try now and be serious. There are a few points to make. First of all, Kirsty made the point, and this is why it's a good political row for the opposition. You always go, you go for the court, you can get the king, as it were. So, Rishi Sunak's terrible judgment.
Yes, well,
and Gavin, so that's fine. But that's obviously that's opposition. That's opposition tactics. I do accept, and we have debated Westminster culture ad infinitum on shows like this, from the sexism and all of
and
that.
it's obviously not
and
fixed.
it is quite clear, you know, that Parliament as an institution to work in and to be an MP is way behind most of the rest of the country in terms of how organisations work. But it is partly, going back to my first point, partly because MPs are peculiar in the sense that they are these kind of autonomous beings. They represent their constituency. They have views. It's just a very odd process.
And some of them don't know how to behave. BBC News story, though. Let's talk about examples in other parties, like yours, the SNP. Patrick Grady, former Chief Whip, to step away from SNP membership over allegations. Now, he actually did admit and apologise for a significant breach of sexual misconduct policy, and he was suspended for a number of days by the party. But you were on the programme in April, Kirsty, talking to me about precisely this case and saying that any MP found guilty of sexual misconduct should be expelled from the party and politics as a whole. He's no longer an SNP MP, he's independent, but he's still there. Do you stand by your comments?
He's been investigated. He has apologised in the House of Commons. As you say, he's not a member of the SNP. It is up to him to make the decisions about what he thinks he should do. He's no longer a member of our party.
Do you think the SNP behaved properly over the incident and the case of Patrick Grady? Because it took some time before an investigation was actually launched into his behaviour.
There was an investigation done by the Independent Complaints Commission, which is the way that it is up to anybody who wants to make a complaint to choose the route that they want to make that complaint.
Right.
And that was the route they chose to make that complaint, and that complaint was dealt with through that process. And I would never suggest that anybody who wants to make a complaint should do it in a certain route. It's up to them to choose the route that is most comfortable for them. And I don't think there's any issue.
He did apologise and he went through the investigation, but he admitted that he had breached the guidelines here when it came to sexual misconduct. Should he still be an MP?
I think it's up to him to make that decisions. I think he needs to think about. I think he needs to think about those decisions. And he has, as I say, he has apologised. He has apologised in the House of Commons. He has been through the Independent Complaints Commission, and he has received the punishment that was meted out as a result of that.
Right, but you did sit here in April and say that anyone found guilty of sexual misconduct shouldn't be in politics at all. They should be expelled from politics altogether.
He has stood up in the House of Commons and he's made that an apology.
So you've changed your
he
mind.
is not a member of the SNP.
Right, so would you welcome him back into the party then?
He's not a member of the SNP. If it was, I have no idea whether or not he is going to make any decisions about trying to come back into the party. I have no idea.
People might want to know your view, that's all.
People might want to know my view. He has stood up and he has made an apology. He's been through the complaints procedure.
If Gavin Williamson apologised, would that be all right?
Gavin Williamson, it appears, is not keen on apologising,
But
but it would be interesting to see if he does. I think, nonetheless, no matter what has happened in relation to this, Rishi Sunak was aware that this complaint was in and still put him in Cabinet.
Is there a problem still with the wider culture at Westminster that just can't seem to be tackled effectively?
I think there is. I mean, we all remember the Westminster stuff that happened in 2017. It felt like, great, we were going to get everything sorted out, and then it kind of bubbles away and forgotten about, move on to the next story. And then all the allegations kind of surface again. And that's what ultimately led to Boris Johnson having to go, you know, with the Chris Pincher stuff. And, you know, there are lots of other individuals under investigation, you know, dozens of unnamed individuals under investigation. It is an unusual place to work. You have to be a particular kind of person to want to be an MP. It's lost on me, quite frankly, but you know, and it is an unusual.
Talking about us, Kirsty, but not about Tom.
I mean, to be fair, that's reasonable.
We're going to end on this story. Let me show you the headline. BBC News, you heard it in our headlines. Elgin Marbles, new body aims to return sculptures. They're known as the Parthenon. Well, they are, in fact, the Parthenon sculptures, known as the Elgin Marbles, to Greece. Now, this is a very long-running dispute, but the former Conservative Culture Minister sitting here with us, Lord Vaizey, is now on a committee to actually do exactly that, return them. Why?
Well, I think I've come around to the view, when I was the Arts Minister, I didn't look at this issue carefully enough. And as the Arts Minister, you don't want to start a row with the British Museum. But having been out of office and reflected on it and been to, with the Parthenon project, to Athens to visit the Acropolis Museum where they would go, I think it's an open and shut case. We know that the sculptures were taken illegally. We know that they were damaged when they were removed from the Acropolis. We know that they were damaged when they were exhibited in the British Museum. We know that they're an integral part of the Acropolis itself, the Parthenon itself. We know that Greece has been asking for them back ever since Greece has become
So why didn't you do anything about it when you were in Paris? It's an open shut case. You did nothing when you were in Paris.
Yeah, it was useless. Absolutely useless.
Right, well, there's no response to that, of course. Are you convinced, Tom, by this compelling case that's suddenly come to Ed Vaizey?
The reason Tom doesn't want to return them is because of climate change. He doesn't want the emissions,
the emissions of travelling.
Take the sculptures back to Athens.
Let's be serious for a second. What was the situation in around 1800 when these marbles were saved
They were
from
not
the Parthenon,
But
which had been used by the Ottoman Empire as a gunpowder store? It had been blown up.
But what's the argument?
Shards of these things scattered across Athens.
And what's the argument today for keeping them?
Let's look at where they were when it was built, right? This was not Greece, the country that we know today. This was
Tom,
an
if your
ancient
house...
Hang on, let him finish.
Polis.
I
The idea that this is some sort of continued era of government is nonsense. And more crucially, what precedent does this set in terms of any museum, in terms of any art gallery, anywhere in the world? Are we going to gut the Louvre as well? Are we going to gut every single collection of objects? Because I'll tell you what, probably not a single object in a single museum anywhere in the world originated from that specific spot. Well, that's an
interesting point, Kirsty, isn't it? Because this in the Times, National Museum of Scotland urged to return Benin bronzes. These are also a broad set of artefacts. I think some have been returned by one of the museums in Glasgow. But as Tom said, does that mean it's open door, everything?
Well, we have got a horrendous colonial history. There's a huge amount of things we did as the British Empire that we have not yet, made sufficient reparations for. We have not yet stood up and apologised and made the response that we need to make in order to acknowledge that history. Absolutely, we should return the Parthenon marbles. Absolutely, Scotland should be returning the Benin bronzes, and we have done so with reparations in some cases. And while we're at it, we would quite like the Lewis chessmen back. These things should be returned to those countries, and I think that's the only way.
And I think we should demand reparations of Saxony and of Denmark. And probably of Rome as well. I mean, how far back are we going to go with this? It's becoming ridiculous. Is 200 years somehow a cut-off point for when a culture can be exploited?
You don't think that we should be apologising for the history that we had? You don't think?
I think we should be demanding apologies from the people of Sweden and of Denmark who came and pillaged and raped. I think we should be demanding apologies from the Normans who swept across this country.
Facetiousness, it doesn't become you. Right, go on. Ed.
What do you want me to say?
Well, how are you going to defend against what you've heard from Tom Harwood about
the interesting thing is that Tom said, should we gut the Louvre? The interesting thing is that Napoleon did loot a lot of stuff, and the Duke of Wellington said at the time that Napoleon should return those artefacts. Now, we know that GB News cannot contradict the Duke of Wellington. He's the patron saint of GB News. So you have to
all right. Enough.
Not that long ago, on his great-grandson who sits as a colleague of yours in the Lords and put forward an amendment to the Environment Bill.
He's so Remain that he's become a crossbencher.
Ed Vaizey, I'm not going to allow you to completely take over this programme in the final minutes.
He ran the first half of the show.
But can I just ask you, can it happen? Because for all your bravado over this issue, can it actually happen when there is a legal protection? There is an act in place that says the British Museum cannot hand back the Parthenon sculptures.
Ideally, the law would be changed, and I had a debate in the House of Lords on that. But in de facto, can it happen? Yes.
But the government says they won't.
Because de facto it can happen because the British Museum is now chaired by a genius.
Yeah.
And that
the government has said they were... Kat, don't laugh, don't humour them. What's your view?
I actually think they should go back. Yeah, I mean, I love going to the British Museum. I'm a big history buff, maybe not as much as Tom, but, I don't see that there is a moral argument for us holding on to them when we know Greece is perfectly capable of looking after them. It's not Greece 200 years ago, it's Greece now.
Right. I mean, and you think it can happen? Even the government says it won't happen.
I think George Osborne
would
like to find some way of a deal, and there has to be give and take on both sides. And to be fair, the Greeks want legal ownership, and that is a big sticking point. But something can be done, and we know from George Osborne, who's now running the government anyway, that things can be done.
That's all we have time for today. Thank you to my guests. I think I'll be back at 11:15 tomorrow with more Politics Live. Bye bye.